Welcome to this live cast on our future economies. Capitalism, despite the tremendous increase in worldwide welfare through its innovative power and freedom, has at the same time a number of negative consequences. A transition is necessary to overcome ecological destruction, decrease in quality of life, and growing inequality. Given geopolitical developments, Europe has an important role to play in this transition. In the livecasts, we will start an open dialogue and discuss this transition with internationally renowned economists from all over the world. Questions will pass by, such as each week, we will discuss these matters with 2 economists, resulting in 10 online dialogues in 10 weeks, where we will share viewpoints and collect ideas on how capitalism's innovative and creative powers can go hand in hand with fostering an equal and just society. A different subject every week. Together we can build a basis for economies that are beneficial to all of us. You can participate by putting your questions and remarks in the chat. So, let's talk.
Professor Pettifor, thank you for joining us tonight here with us, for being here with us. Thank you. In your book, The Case for the Green New Deal in 2019, you take up arms against defeatism with regard to the climate crisis. We need to act, and we need to act now. I know this may be a difficult question, but what is your case for the Green New Deal in short?
The case for the Green New Deal is simply this. That it's imperative for the environmental movement to understand that in order for us to save the planet, we have to transform the economic system. And what happened in the past, my experience, is environmentalists worried enormously about the environment, about nature, about water, about trees, and about biodiversity, and sort of believed that the economy belonged in another box and someone else was responsible for it. And so the case for the New Deal, the Green New Deal, is that we should do what Roosevelt did in 1933. He actually brought together the issues of the economy and of the environment. You must remember he was dealing with desertification in the United States, the desertification of the Great Plains, which they called the Dust Bowl, right? So he had an enormous environmental challenge, plus he had an enormous unemployment challenge. And what he did was he understood you had to change the economic system in order to deal with the ecosystem. And that is the case for the Green New Deal.
Yes. So just as with Professor Steinberg, I'd like to start with the corona crisis, just take that as a leeway point into further discussion. Actually, a reappreciation of government interaction in the market and taking back some control that we've granted to the market that we left over there. Now, during the corona crisis, we've seen some financial stimulus programs of central banks, governments, etc. Have these been good for the ecological agenda in general or not?
No, they haven't. They've been designed to bail out the private finance sector and the private markets. You know, they've helped companies like Apple, which really didn't need help at all. And to an extent, they have helped governments to spend, and that has happened here in Britain, and it's happening in the United States. But the fact of the matter is that the real intention of the central banks was to protect the finance, in particular the private Wall Street and the City of London and Frankfurt. Those were the targets for protection, not the people of Britain, Europe and the United States or China. China and Vietnam are very different here, but of other countries. So the aim is not to protect the people. The aim is to protect, in particular, financial markets, but also commercial markets. That's what it has been about. And we've seen it happen. So, for example, as Julia rightly said, here in Britain, we've watched as the government has protected markets in pharmaceuticals, right? Has allowed them to take control of the administration of the test and traced and isolation system. We have a public health sector that could do this very efficiently. And we know that the only way to tackle a plague, a pandemic, is by putting boots on the ground and knocking on doors in order to check whether or not people had been tested and were isolating. But that has no longer taken place here. Instead, the invisible hands of the market have been put in charge of testing and tracing, and it has failed catastrophically. So we've seen governments, and our governments are neoliberal governments, they are governments in hock to these markets. We've seen them target their support to those markets and not to the people. And that's what's causing a major political eruption, both here in Britain, but I'm afraid around the world. I really do. I think it explains in part the kind of support that Donald Trump gets. You know, it's extraordinary to me on the eve of the United States election that 45% of Americans still support Donald Trump. And they do that because they believe that somehow he's challenging the economic system. You know, they're wrong, of course, but that's what they believe. They believe that the rest are all in cahoots with the system. And I have to say, there is some truth in that.
Yeah, so it has been in favor of markets and not especially...
I'm sorry, but it's quite hard to hear you. When you introduced it, it goes very quiet. So could you start again, please?
Is it audible right now?
Yeah, it's audible now.
Thank you. So it's been beneficiary to markets, but not necessarily to the people. But then the argument will also go, people would say, well, in the end, markets also benefit people. So what would you say to those individuals who say that?
I would say that we've had markets for 5,000 years or more. You know, societies invented markets way even before, in prehistory, really. We had systems where we exchanged and undertook transactions. It's perfectly natural. But we managed those markets. You know, the heads of our community, our unions, our collective bodies, our society managed the market. Is the market open every day? No, we only open on Wednesdays or Fridays. Who is allowed to sell at the market? We decided. What are they allowed to sell? Are they allowed to sell a pint of beer when actually they're only selling a half a pint of beer in there? Who is measuring the pint of beer? Who is measuring the yard of cloth, right? We, for all time, have managed that process of markets, right? So we've welcomed markets into our communities, but on conditions and terms. We have a small market in my town. We decide when it is they can operate, when they can open up their stores. We decide who can do that. We decide what they can sell. We don't allow them to sell drugs, for example. So our problem has been that we've allowed markets to, in fact, govern us, while we've given up the government of markets. And that's what's delusional. It's crazy. You know, markets can't do that. They are a kind of abstract place where we undertake transactions. Yeah. They are not a form of government. And yet we are governed by, for example, Wall Street. Wall Street is a market in finance. They effectively govern the global economy. And they did that before the 1930s as well, and caused the 1929 crash and a devastating depression, and then ultimately a world war. So, you know, we are very familiar with how markets can destroy our economies and can lead to war. And yet we still allow politicians to give markets, or people who work in markets, enormous powers.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're going to discuss this at further length during the discussion part. Before we move on to the ecology, Professor Pettifor, I'd like to ask you about another topic, which is very prevalent within your work in the production of money in 2015, but also in the case for the New Green Deal. You put a lot of emphasis on monetary issues. It's kind of being kind of the ground on which we build our economic system and society, etc. Why is it so crucial to address these monetary issues, to your mind? And what issues do we need to address today rather than tomorrow?
So the reason why it's important to address monetary issues is that money is absolutely fundamental to the way our economy operates. We all know that. For all of us, for our daily lives, money is so important. And yet we don't understand what it is. We don't understand where it comes from. We don't know who produces it. And we don't know the terms on which they produce it, really. We're ignorant as a society on the whole. And I have to say, it's not just ordinary people in the street who are ignorant. Economists are ignorant. Until 2014, when the Bank of England stopped the debate by issuing a document in which they explained how credit is created, how money is created, you know, we had a huge argument between old-fashioned orthodox economists and those of us who are monetary theorists, right? And it's shocking to me that after, we have a brilliant Scottish economist. We had a brilliant Scottish economist here, John Law, in 1694, 1680s, 90s. He understood the nature of money, the nature of credit. He understood that all money is credit, right? And yet still today, our economics profession doesn't understand this and doesn't talk about it. Now, for me, this may make me sound as if I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I think there's a reason for that. It's better that we don't know. It's better that the 1%, Wall Street, the City of London, Frankfurt, understand and hold and manage the whole thing. It's better that the public should be ignorant from that point of view, right? So the economists are playing a game with the 1% to keep us all ignorant. And when we're ignorant, that means they can use money to exploit us. And boy, do they do that. The amount of credit circulating in the economy is 3 times the amount of real economic output, basically. It's just extraordinary. So, money can be created out of thin air, essentially, by central banks, but most of money is created by private banks. And they're created every time you and I apply for a loan. We ask for a loan, we ask for money, and the private banks have been given a license to provide us with that money, but on terms and conditions. Number one, we have to sign a contract and promise to repay. Number two, we have to often provide collateral to prove that we're worth what we say we're worth. We have to show our paycheck to check that we're able to blah, and we have to apply a rate of interest. And when we do that, the banks enter numbers into a computer and transform it to your account, as we all know from our own experience, but with those terms and conditions, right? That's how effortless it is to create money. So banks can do that. They can do all kinds of con tricks. For example, they can lie about collateral. They can set up dodgy contracts. They can charge very high rates of interest for nothing, for an activity that's effectively effortless. So because we don't understand how the money is created, they can do all that. They can cheat and lie and make extraordinary sums of money, so historically unprecedented. And that's why I think understanding money is so important.
All right. And just one final quick question, Professor Pettifor. Why do we need to understand the way that this money, what we learn when we take note of the historic so-called conspiracy that you mentioned, or the things that we don't know about money, what we learn with regard to ecology? What can we learn from that? What is the relation there?
Well, our relationship is this. It's quite straightforward. That in order to repay interest on debt, which doesn't take any effort to create, you have to extract assets from labor on the one hand, you have to exploit people, and from the earth on the other. You have to chop down trees, you have to fish the seas, you have to exploit the land, you have to till the land until, there is no land left, or to repay these huge sums of money generated by interest. So for us, as ecologists, we have to understand the direct link. When Brazil burns down her forests in order to grow soya beans, that's because forestry doesn't give her enough hard currency to repay her foreign debts. So she has to grow soya beans, which is more profitable for her, right? So we need to understand that actually a lot of the exploitation of the earth and extraction of fossil fuels, of the land, yes, and of all the earth's assets is to repay the financiers, to repay Wall Street, the City of London and Frankfurt. And when we get that, we'll understand that one of the reasons why we've had this conflict with nature is because we've been stripping forests, we've been mining, we've been building houses, we've been expanding economic activity into those wildlife habitats. Yes. And that's given us a massive, massive climate crisis problem, and now equally an enormous public health problem in the form of pandemics. And yes, by the way, there are meant to be pandemics in the pipeline coming down the road.
All right, a very ominous tale. Thank you, Professor Pettifor. And let's move on to the discussion part.
Can I just interrupt you for a moment? Julia is a professor. I'm not a professor. So thank you very much for the honor, but I'm not a professor. I'm a doctor, perhaps. Yeah.
How would you like us to address you?
Dr. Pettifor.
Dr. Pettifor. Okay, thank you very much. We'll do so from here on out.
Yeah.